Like most kids that grew up in the valley, I had a strong interest in cruising. When I got to college, and I actually studied a lot of anthropology, I began to realize that that was a uniquely American mating ritual involving automobiles. I came up with the idea of doing the movie. It was in the 60s. It was, the hippie culture, drugs, cruising was gone, and I really felt compelled to sort of document the whole experience of cruising and what my generation used as a way of meeting girls and what we did in our spare time. So after I finished THX, I was didn't quite know what to do. Francis had challenged me to do something warm and fuzzy.
I was very much advising that George focus on writing and that that he no doubt had the talent to write and that ultimately it was all in the vision and the script, and that he could write something and make a film that would have a strong audience enjoyment as part of it. So he sat down and wrote American Graffiti.
I wanted to document the end of an era, how things change, how one of the life passages, how you go from being a student into the real world, and you leave your hometown, you leave your family, you leave everything behind, and you go off on your own. And parallel that with what was going on in the United States at that time in terms of the loss of innocence, getting into the Vietnam War, the advent of British rock. Generally issues that centered around the idea of change. I talked to Bill and Gloria about the project.
And he said, why don't you come over, I want to talk to you about something. So we went over and he said, yeah, I want to do a movie about rock and roll. I'd love for you guys to write it and so forth. So we said, terrific. And I think it was almost a year later when he said, let's do it now.
And we sat down, talked about the story outline I developed in terms of the various characters and the various story elements that happened.
Which was initially just talking about people we knew in high school. We had all gone to high school at the same time, and I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, so, that was a cruising culture, too. And we thought about friends of ours and what the various stories might be. And then we started outlining, and we put a lot of cards up on a bulletin board. And I think we wrote a 15-page treatment.
And I took that treatment around to all the studios to see if I could get some money so that Bill and Gloria could write the script. Because I'd finished writing THX, and I swore I'd never write another screenplay as long as I lived. So I took it around to all the studios. Nobody wanted to do it. And I couldn't get any money to develop the screenplay. And this went on for quite a while. My first film, THX, had been entered in the Cannes Film Festival in the Director's Fortnight, which is, your first film. There's a little side festival that has to do with directors and their first films. Warner Brothers was not real happy with me for making that movie, and they weren't going to pay my way to Europe or anything. But I had some money left over just from doing THX, and I decided to blow it all on a trip to Europe. I had been dealing with United Artists on the West Coast as sort of vice president, and I said, this isn't getting me anywhere. I'm going to go and talk to the president of the company, who was David Picker. So when I was at the Cannes Film Festival, the one thing I got to do was go up in this big fancy hotel. We were staying on the outskirts in some little pension. I went in there and he said, well, I read the story treatment. It sort of makes sense to me. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you $10,000 to write the script. I immediately called Bill and Gloria on the phone and said, I got the money, you can start today.
And he said, so when I get back, you should have the script done. And I said, well, it'll take us a little longer than that.
And they said, oh, we're in the middle of doing a cheapy horror movie.
I said, George, I want to direct, and this is a chance for me to make the movie, so, we're really going to have to back out of this.
And I said, oh dear, what am I going to do? And so I called back here and got another friend of mine who had gone to school with, and I said, we've got this story treatment, we've got this outline, and I need a script, and I want to try to get it by the time I get back from Europe. I got back from Europe. I read this screenplay, which was very, very different than story treatment. It was sort of hot rods to hell. It was a very, very different, much more theatrical kind of piece. And I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? He got paid all the money, so I had no money left. I had no script, and I had to turn something into United Artists. So I sat down, and I started from scratch, and I wrote a new script based on the story treatment that Bill and Gloria and I had worked out. And finished it in 3 weeks, turned it over to United Artists, and they hated it.
They said, we don't want to make this movie.
It's a musical montage. There's no characters. There's no story. They said, no, we don't want to do this.
So I think for a year, George went around trying to get Graffiti made.
Nobody wanted to do it. So then I came back, and I was running out of money because I'd spent most of my money on going to Europe. So I was getting pretty desperate. And I started getting job offers because of THX. They started offering me to do basically record albums. Things like Tommy and Hair and, you know, all kind of movies that don't have any plots. But I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do a rewrite on this script. So I did another rewrite on the script, took it around to all the studios again, and finally Universal said, well, this is an interesting project. I think we'll do it. They said, well, one thing you need is we need to connect some kind of name to this. And I said, well, you know, it's a cast of teenagers. How in the world am I going to get a name connected? I said, well, it could be anybody. It could be, you know, a producer or somebody. And so I went back to Francis, and I said, Francis, they want a name. And he had just finished shooting The Godfather, and it was about to come out. And so the talk was really high on it. And I said, would you like to produce this for me, because I need a name?
Well, I believed in American Graffiti from the moment I read it, and thought it was very funny and very warm, and I said, of course.
So we went back to Universal, and I said, well, what about Francis? Would he be a big enough name for you? And they said, oh, yeah, great, you got Francis. You got the deal. So I got the deal, and we started casting, and we started getting ready to make the movie. And I said, I read the script, and I said, you know, this script still needs a lot of work, especially the Steve and Laurie story was very weak. So I called up Bill and Gloria. This was about 2 years later. You know, it's taken me about 2 years to get from the first phone call, hey, do you want to do the script, to this phone call, which is, I'm about to go into production. Do you want to do a quick rewrite for me?
We had talked about this so thoroughly, and we knew the characters so well that when we went back, we were able, you know, to pull everything together that we had wanted originally.
They came in and rewrote the script for me at the last minute and really punched up the Steve and Laurie story.
And there was no discussion, no studio, nothing. George loved it, and that was it.
That's really the story of how the whole thing got started. When I grew up, I did a lot of cruising, and I grew up working in a foreign car service. I wanted to be a race driver, and I was a mechanic through most of high school. So to me, cars were my life, and that's what I thought I was going to end up doing, was being a mechanic and racing cars the rest of my life. So the cars were very central to me in the movie, and the relationship that the people had with the cars. And it sort of got into an area that I was very interested in, still am, in terms of man's relationship to machines, and also the intimate nature of people's familiarity with disc jockeys who they've never met, who is basically a fictitious fantasy character that they become very friendly with because they listen to them all the time on the radio, especially if they're cruising at night. There's this fantasy character that actually becomes a real part of your life, and that had to do with sort of technology and people's relationship to technology, and sometimes how they relate better to the disc jockey than they do to the person sitting next to them in the car. So I was taking all these themes and putting them together. I was very interested in the relationship between teenagers and rock and roll. I grew up on rock and roll, and I saw a great shift in rock and roll in the early 60s when the British invasion came, and the old innocent rock and roll, you know, came out of the blues, was kind of being distilled and moved into different directions. So when I wrote the film, I would play the music. I'd select a piece of music for each scene.
It was really the first film to have wall-to-wall classic rock soundtrack, something that, you know, is set a precedent, is fairly common today, such that now you have a credit for somebody on films called music supervisor, and that's their responsibility, choosing the songs. Well, this position didn't exist at that time, and George really created it, and he did it himself. So as he was writing the screenplay, he had his sister's 45 RPM record player and this stack of rock and roll 45 RPM records from the late 1950s, early 1960s.
I had a big rock and roll record library from when I was in high school. I kept everything I had. So I used it. I would pick a particular song and say, okay, this is the song that sort of is this scene, and I would write the scene to that song.
And as he was writing the scene, he'd also write down what he was listening to at the time.
So there was a very, very strong relationship between the song and the scene that was written to go with that song. In a way, they're all my character except maybe for Steve, which is why the Steve and Laurie scene, I had a hard time writing them, and why ultimately Bill and Gloria had to write that. I think the character I identify with is Kurt, because he's the one that leaves town, he's the one that goes off, he's the one that has the adventure, and that's what I did. I obviously started out as Terry the Toad, I think everybody does, and so I took my early years of really pre-driving when I was 14 and 15, and that was the basis of that character, plus a lot of friends of mine that I knew. And then eventually, when I was in junior college, I was more like, John Milner, and I was more, I had a race car, until I almost got killed in it. So that part of the relationship between racing and, always on the edge of getting killed and that sort of thing was where that character came from. But there's this other side of me, which is the anthropologist side, I'm going to get out of town and try to make something of myself. I'm going to go do something really crazy, like go to film school. That's the Kurt side.
A lot of the stuff with Rick Dreyfuss and the teacher, the English teacher, when Rick is trying to figure out whether he really should leave town and so forth, those were things that happened to me. I had a friend who went off to Middlebury College and only lasted a semester and then came back. A lot of the things were sort of created from fables. The obvious thing when you go into a liquor store and you're trying to cover the fact that you don't have an ID, and then just odd ideas like, well, what if somebody's coming in at the same moment to rob it, and they get the liquor for you. Candy Clark's based on people we knew. There were always girls like that.
And Cindy is based on sort of with girls from that period, that era in time, and her feelings about the Ronnie Howard character. And the Ronnie Howard character is, the big man on campus, that type of high school hero, but who's kind of limited in many ways. Is based on people you went to school with.
I have other friends that were sort of hot dog racers that I knew, that I hung out with. And it was based on a lot of different composites of friends. We named it after John Milius, the character, because he was kind of a boisterous, full of himself character. Bill and Gloria were very good friends of John, so we all decided to do homage to John. But it was actually based more on racing friends that I had in Modesto than my film school friends. Well, the person you should probably talk to really is Fred Roos, because he's the one that did all the casting.
Well, in those days I was a casting director, and I had just done The Godfather with Francis Coppola.
Fred Roos is an extraordinary eye for talent and loves actors and keeps track of them. So when American Graffiti came along and there were the roles for so many wonderful young people.
And we spent weeks and weeks and weeks, months and months, seeing hundreds of actors.
Basically, I cast the movie by doing a lot of hard work. I cast it for 6 months. I saw thousands of kids.
I would do a lot of pre-interviewing of people that I didn't know, and then when George was ready to interview, we would just set up in an office. I think it was right here on the Universal Lot somewhere, and see people all day long.
I'd see everyone for about 5 minutes, talk to them for a few minutes, and then I'd make out a list of the ones that I thought had potential.
And that went on for quite a few weeks, many weeks.
It was a real eye-opener for me, beginning with the casting sessions.
I had been a casting director of Andy Griffith for a couple of years, and then the entire run of the Mayberry RFD series. So I had been around Ronnie for some years, and so I'm growing up into a teenager. He was so identified with those shows that he was not instantly sought out to be in movies, and at least my perception, he was kind of in a down period of his career, even at 18.
When I went into the audition with George, it was just a 5-minute meeting, and I told him that I was planning to go to USC as a film student. We talked about that a little bit. And then I said, now look, I know I don't want to do damage to my hopes here, because I'd like to be considered for the movie, but I can't sing. He said, well, what difference does that make? And I said, well, my agent told me it's a musical. He said, well, it is a musical. I said, well, I can't sing. He said, it doesn't matter that you can't sing. And that was the end of the interview, this very cryptic sort of conclusion.
Richard was just an actor, a young actor around town who was going on interviews, and I had interviewed him on several occasions for TV shows or other movies I was casting. I had never connected with him on found the perfect part for him or got him into anything I was doing, but I continued to bring him in because I liked his work. I thought he was incredibly talented.
What I do remember is that there were readings, then there were more readings, then there were more readings, and then George brought potential groups together.
And I'd bring those kids back, I'd have them do readings from the script, and then I'd whittle it down to another group, and then I would take that group and I'd shoot video tests of that group.
It's the first time I ever saw videotape used. And so I thought, well, I must be getting kind of close. And by now I was zeroed in on the role of Steve.
And I finally did 16mm screen tests with the final group.
And Haskell Wexler shot it. And I think that was the first time that I actually auditioned with Cindy Williams.
I screen tested with Ron Howard, and I think we did the dance scene and holding scripts.
I don't care if you leave this second.
What is wrong with you? You're acting like a snotty little bitch who wants everybody to...
What did you call me? Oh, God, come on.
I thought you didn't want to dance.
Listen, smile or something, Steve. Everybody's watching. Don't patronize me. You think I'd care if you go away? You think I'm gonna crack up or something? Boy, are you conceited.
You quit bitching.
Paul Amat was one of the ones I thought of when I first read the script. He was a boxer, but he was also getting his feet wet as an actor and going on interviews. And I had interviewed him a few times.
And he said, I got an interview for you, and went upstairs, and there was this quiet, kind of unassuming guy sitting behind his desk. And they said, well, this is George. He's making this movie, and it's about hot rods and things, and there's a role for you in it as this main hot rodder. And I said, well, great.
Oh, great. Get down. Hey! How's it going?
Is this what they call copying a field?
What? No, get up! Oh, my God, don't say that! Oh, Jesus.
And I just stood there and didn't know what to say, and he was looking at me and saying, so I hear you're a boxer. I said, well, yeah, I'm a boxer, but you can act. I said, well, I think so, and okay, thank you, see you later. And that was it.
Terry the Toad was one of the hardest parts, and even during the screen testing period, I didn't really feel that we had Terry the Toad. We tested some people, and then my partner in my casting company then, Mike Fenton, called me up I think it was right when we were testing, said I just interviewed an actor that could be right for Terry the Toad, and he sent him over to me.
Hi. Hello. Buenos noches. You need a lift somewhere?
So I did a cold reading, stone cold. I hadn't seen the script, nothing. And I remember standing in the lobby there of the Thalberg building, and this guy that I later found out was George, walked by, and George Lucas looked at me and said, "Are you an actor person?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Huh."
It's bitch and tuck and roll. You know, I really love the feel of tuck and roll upholstery.
Yeah. Well, come on in. I'll let you feel it. I mean, touch it. The upholstery.
Okay.
Jack Nicholson was an old friend of mine. I was going to New York once to see actors for some film or other, and Jack says, oh, when you go to New York, you should look up this girl, Candy Clark. She's a model with Ford or one of those big modeling agencies in New York. And he says, I think she has something, and she thinks she could be used in film.
I had heard that they were going to film this film, American Graffiti, and it took place in the 50s, so I thought, this time I'm going to dress up, and I'm going to go in costume, and they're going to see me, and they're going to think I'm perfect for the part. So I get to the appointment, and I meet George Lucas. He talks to me for a brief moment, and then I'm dismissed. And then as I leave, I thought, I blew it, you know? I blew it. I'm the only one here dressed up like this, and I blew it. I look like I'm so desperate for a job, they'll never hire me now.
No, well, my name's Carol, Mr. Med. What's your first name?
I remember a friend of mine asked me if I would go see his son in a little rock band at Hoot Night at the Troubadour. And so I did, and the lead singer in the band was Mackenzie.
And even though I'd spent a lot of time around the industry with, you know, my stepmother, Michelle Phillips, and my dad, Papa John from the Mamas and the Papas, I was still kind of naive and lived in the San Fernando Valley, lived with my mother, who was a very strict kind of Eastern Seaboard socialite lady who'd moved to California. And Fred Roos came up to me and he said, how'd you like to be in a movie? And I said, wow, that would be really cool, okay? Because I was just a complete Valley girl. And my mother came up behind him and said, she's only 12, you know. Because I looked older and I was sort of mature in a way. And I remember that we went for an audition, and there were hundreds of girls there. It was like a big audition.
How old are you?
I'm too old for you.
Oh, you can't be that old.
When I first spoke to Fred Roos and then later to George Lucas about American Graffiti, I was in the middle of a very successful carpentry career.
Fred convinced him to come out of retirement to come and do American Graffiti because he'd kind of written off the film business at that point.
He was doing carpentry he had 2 kids and he had to put food on the table, so he had learned carpentry and was earning money at that, and I gave him a lot of work in carpentry. He'd rebuilt a lot of things in my house and built quite a bit of furniture for me. Bo, again, as an actor, I had interviewed, I think I had even used him in some Andy Griffith or Mayberry RFD or a couple other series that I had been casting, so I knew him and knew his work. He was a working actor, young actor, and I just brought him in to George, and he won his part through testing, as did everybody else.
Well, Wolfman Jack, again, was one of those real characters. I mean, when I was cruising the streets of Modesto, Wolfman Jack was the disc jockey of choice, and he broadcast from who knows where. It really was from Mexico someplace. It was a very powerful station. We'd pick it up in Modesto, and it was a crazy radio station, and we all loved it. So I went to do the movie. I knew I wanted Wolfman Jack.
George knew about Wolfman Jack, but I had some relationship with him. I think Wolfman Jack had called me up once and introduced himself, or had tried to reach me for something else, and so I proposed that we get the real guy, and George was thrilled that we could have him.
He was a legend. I wanted to have that be the pivotal character in the movie because he really was the kind of mythical fantasy character that I was dealing with in terms of the fantasy of radio.
I heard that the best acting teacher at a high school that had the best theater program of any high school was Mount Tamalpais High School in Marin County.
And our drama teacher, Dan Caldwell, said, oh, they're going to have a big, in those days, they referred to atmosphere as, they said, a cattle call.
But I think I called him up and just says, who are your good people who are in school now or have recently been in school who still look like they're in high school? And I think he sent me several people, but I think he very, very much recommended Kathleen.
And he walked me into this room with Fred and George Lucas, Francis Coppola, and I met them all, and they were all really nice, I thought. And they asked me to come back and read for this little part.
I get to this casting call and I walk in. Could have been 200 blondes sitting there, and they were beautiful. And I looked at Gino, the casting agent, and I said, I can't wait. Look at who's here, and I won't be able to afford dinner. I won't be able to pay for the parking. I can't wait to be called in as the 201st blonde. And he said, well, the director was kind of interested in your picture. I said, he was? He said, let me go in and talk to him. So he came out and he said, George Lucas would like to see you right now. I sat down. He said, can you drive? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, thank you very much. And I thought, well, I'm glad I didn't waste all that time sitting here and the money for the parking, and I wouldn't have had dinner because obviously I didn't get this. So I went home, and when I got home, the phone was ringing, and they said, you've got it.
Then I had to come back one more time for an improv test, which I'd never been asked to do in my life.
Said it!
And sat around and improvised, and George put various groups, combinations of actors together, and we improv. And so finally, a few days after that, I found out that I got the part.
I guess it was a couple months later I got a call that said, you got the part. And I said, what part? What are you talking about? In the movie. You got the part in the movie. And I was rolling around like a puppy dog. I was so excited.
After having read the script, I decided that I wanted to play any part but the part of Laurie. And that is the part that George wanted me for. And I said, but Laurie is no fun to play. The other two girls are, that's where the fun is. Debbie, that's the part I want. So I at first said no.
Lo and behold, I got the part. I couldn't believe it. Years later, I asked George, hey, whatever happened to that screen test we did? And he said, oh, well, that came out black. And I said, well, how did you hire me then? And he said, well, I just liked what I saw through the viewfinder.
Francis Coppola called me on the phone and said, Cindy, you want to do this movie because it's really going to be something, which was the second time I heard that, and so I did.
Then the next thing, I got called to come back like 2 days later and do a final screen test. And then they offered it to me. I was delighted.
And I got it. With no, I had no intention of doing this. At that time, I was an athlete. I was a competitive gymnast.
I was hitchhiking on Santa Monica Boulevard, and this guy picked me up and he said, hi, how you doing? He was very friendly, and I said, fine. And he said, don't you remember me? I said, no. And he said, I'm the writer, Willard. It was Willard and Huyck, one of the two writers. And he said, did they call you? Did they call you? Did they tell you the good news? And I said, what good news? He said, oh, well, I better not say. I better not say anything. I said, oh, you mean I got the job? He said, well, I better not say anything.
Well, the most significant thing about this picture for me was that it was the first time that I played a role that was large enough that that role's importance to the overall success of the film was significant.
George actually gave me a choice of roles. He said you could play either my character or the character that Ronnie Howard played. And I chose Kurt, which I felt was a great compliment to me.
The movie was set at night. It was about a phenomenon that took place at night, and usually, although the film cost about $750,000, that was the number that we thought of as so-called personal movies. I think under $1 million was what we thought a film should cost.
The first thing that I found out was that they wanted to give me that haircut. And I was horrified. I don't want to have my hair cut like that. Oh, I really didn't want to. I fought it. Can't we do something else? And George thought that would be great, you know. Oh, and I had to wear that thing. Oh, it was so embarrassing. It was awful. Because when you washed it, you know, it was long on the sides and short on the top. And then when you washed it, then you had this crew cut up here, but then you had this kind of long hair hang over your ears. How could I walk around, you know, during the days or on the weekends? Or, oh, it was horrible. Wear a hat everywhere. It was just, oh.
It was a time when most people had longer hair than a crew cut, and I was afraid that that should something else come up, some other acting job come up, I might not be able to do it because of the crew cut. So I convinced George that a white cowboy hat might do as well.
I remember the wardrobe fitting, and I remember the hair lady deciding that they had to do this thing with double ponytails, like one ponytail just below the other, to make it look like my hair was longer than it really was. And I remember being disappointed because I had to wear this big, giant, shapeless t-shirt and jeans through the whole movie, and I didn't get to wear, like, pretty dresses or anything.
Haskell would use me to get focus. You know, he'd ask me to stand in front of the camera so that he could focus on the test pattern that I was wearing. I hated that shirt. I thought it was geeky.
The movie takes place at night in a town, and we had 27 shooting days in this location. And so we made a deal with San Rafael, which is the local town that I live next door to. We shot one day in San Rafael. It was a difficult day. It was our first day of shooting. Had a very short shooting schedule. The first day shooting involved camera mounts. The grips and the crew came in early, you know, like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We didn't have to shoot until 9 to put these camera mounts on the cars. At 9 o'clock I came in and they hadn't gotten the camera mounts on the cars. I said, what's going on? And I said, well, we're having a little bit of trouble. We'll get it fixed out. Don't worry. It'll just be a few minutes. At 1 o'clock in the morning, we were all ready to go to lunch, the lunch break, and they still hadn't gotten the camera mounts. He said, don't worry, we'll have it done by after lunch. Well, here I was on the first day shooting, I've already lost a half a day shooting. So after lunch we get there, the camera mounts are ready, we start shooting on the streets of San Rafael, finish at 5 o'clock in the morning, come in the next day to go to work at 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing I get when I get in the office is, well, we have a problem. The city of San Rafael called and they're throwing the contract out, they don't want us here anymore, so we can't shoot in San Rafael anymore. So I jumped in the car and we drove down to Petaluma, which is about 20 minutes from here. It's a nice little town. Petaluma opened their arms to us and saved us by letting us shoot on short notice, and the whole film was actually shot in Petaluma. San Rafael did let us come back one day and shoot a montage of just cars cruising, so we'd, most of the just generic cruising shots were shot on that day.
The other issue was that George had envisioned shooting the entire film with 2 cameras and without having a director of photography, and he got 2 good cameramen and basically said, you each shoot what the actors are doing and get what you can. And the first
week we started shooting, I was shooting at very, very low light levels. I wanted to shoot this without much light, with just little tiny bits of light. And the operators were both looking, saying, we can't hold focus because the depth of field is like 6 inches. So every time the actor moves, it goes out of focus and we can't follow it fast enough because it's just too shallow.
At those low light levels, most of the stuff was out of focus. And I, as a producer, I remember I was in a hospital at that time with some sort of back problem, and I was worried.
And so finally I gave in and said, well, okay, maybe we need to shoot this with a little bit more light. And so I asked Haskell, who had helped me get into USC.
And I got a call from George, actually, and then later Francis Coppola. Would I come up to San Francisco area and shoot for him? And I said, okay, but I was working during the day, and so I went up every night. Got the plane, and actually a couple times they helicoptered me in from Sausalito.
And he was actually shooting commercials during the day, and every night he'd get on an airplane, fly up here, shoot all night, get on an airplane, fly back home, and shoot commercials all day.
So I worked until the sun came up, and then I went back to LA.
And he did this for, for 6 weeks, well, 5 weeks.
The lighting, big night exteriors, particularly when the film was much slower than it is now. It took a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of expertise. For this film, I was able to get recreational vehicle lights inside the car so that we could see the actors in the car. And as far as lighting the streets, mostly we just simulated the street lights, or if there were indeed street lights there, we would put 1,000-watt or 2,000-watt Nook lights on the top of the place where normal street lights are to enhance the street lights and increase it. And if there were store windows and so forth, we would find out what store owners would allow us to open up their stores or leave those stores at night, so we would have some light from the stores.
It was great because, we went from shooting at like 8 to 12-foot candles to a few hundred, which was much easier on the operators, and they were much happier about the whole situation.
George did tell me he wanted the film to look like a jukebox. Strong colors. Nowadays, a lot of films we try to desaturate and have pastel colors, but this was certainly some picture that George was correct in the visual thing that he wanted in Graffiti. And the film was shot in Techniscope, which is just one step up from 16 millimeter as far as negative size. It was sort of the poor man's anamorphic.
It's widescreen, but it uses only half of the 35 millimeter frame, so the effect is all the grain and desaturation of 16 millimeter. So in a way it has this kind of documentary 16 millimeter look, yet the widescreen scope and frame, and so it was a really inspired decision and a great way to go.
He was very imaginative. He shot, I know, those moving car scenes with double cameras, so that really when the actors in American Graffiti are in two parallel cars talking to each other. In fact, the camera was between them, two cameras sticking out of two windows, actually photographing the two sides of the conversation at the same time. And that was an innovation George came up with just to basically get more done each night.
I shot the film very much like a documentary film. I would set the scene up, I'd talk to the actors about what was going to happen, where they were going to go, and what they were going to do. I'd take the cameras, I'd set them off with long lenses, and then I'd let the actors run through the scene with each other.
We'd get out on the set. It was all nights, so we'd sleep till like 2, and then the actors would all get together. We were so gung-ho about this. We really felt like we could show what we could do in this movie. It was good writing, and George had even though the movie was being made for no money, and there was no budget at all, it still had Haskell Wexler working on it, and Francis Ford Coppola producing it, you know. It's just like, we thought maybe somebody might see this movie someday, so let's do the best we can. And we would get together in each other's rooms and rehearse. Gino Havens, who had been the casting assistant, was dialogue coach. He'd run lines with us because George wanted to make sure that we all knew our lines. He didn't have time to mess around on the set with actors not knowing their lines. So we'd rehearse in the afternoon, then around 6 we'd get our call. We'd go out to work. And George would I don't know, we'd go out there on the set, we'd be doing a scene, you know, standing around a car, and he'd say, so where do you want to stand? I was expecting the director would block the scene. Tell you be here, but George would just say, how do you want to do this? So I'd say, well, I don't know, I guess I'll lean against this car, and I'd stand over here and he'll stand over there, and then we'd start doing these scenes. And one of the first things George told us, one of the first things he said was, I wrote this script, so I'm giving you free rein to change any line you want. Say it however you would say it. Because he wanted that very naturalistic feel. So we'd just stand around the cars, and then we'd do these scenes. We'd do them over and over. And after each one, he'd say, that was terrific. Let's do it again. And so we'd all look at each other and say, if it's terrific, why are we doing it again? You know, what does that mean exactly? But he just wanted to see what would happen.
Basically, what I got from George after each take was terrific. That I remember, that was his word. Terrific, and this.
Because that's all he ever said about any scene. Terrific. And as actors, you know, we kind of wanted this sort of dialogue, this sort of exchange. And at one point, I went to George and I said, "Well, am I doing okay for you? Because you're not saying much, to tell you the truth." And he said, "No." He said, "I'm getting great material." And he said, "I'm shooting this in a kind of a documentary style. So I want this naturalism. If you're really doing anything that I didn't like, I'd tell you, but it's great." And he says, and frankly, we're going so fast, we're on such a low budget and such a fast schedule, that I'm going to really wind up doing most of my directing in the editing room. I'm going to make a lot of choices and really define the movie in the editing room.
I had to make this entrance on this Vespa, and like so many of the vehicles in the movie, it wasn't really a particularly good thing. I mean, it looked fine, but it didn't run very well.
And he didn't know how to drive a motorbike.
I had like an hour before we shot the scene to practice taking it around the parking lot of the drive-in.
I showed him a little bit, and somebody else showed him.
My plan, because I was supposed to do something funny on the entrance, that was what was called for in the script, I thought I would ride it in, bump up over a curb, put the thing into like third, and let the clutch out so it would jerk. And I thought that would be funny. I got ready. We stopped traffic on Van Ness in San Francisco because it was right in the middle of downtown. There's a big crane and everything. I mean, it was a huge deal. So I came in. I finally got the Vespa and came around, bumped up over the curb. It wasn't really all that good a bump. I wasn't that happy with it. And I couldn't get it into third. So I just left it in first and let the clutch out, hoping it would stall. But instead, it took off. So this thing scoots forward this way with me still hanging on to it, bangs into a trash thing that was there, and then finally stalls and dies. And if you look at the movie, I stand there for a minute thinking somebody's going to say cut, right? Because this was a mistake. This wasn't supposed to happen. And I'm waiting. I don't hear George saying cut. So I figure, you know, good theater-trained actor, keep acting. So I saw Ronnie and I walked over to him. We started playing the thing. And then later on, I apologized. I said to George, I'm sorry about that. I couldn't control the thing, and I don't know how to ride a Vespa. He said, no, it was great. We're keeping it. There are a lot of mistakes in the movie. And it seems to me that every mistake that happened, he'd cut into the picture. In fact, I thought that he would keep doing takes until something would go wrong, and then that's the one that he would print, that's the one that he'd like. The scene where I robbed the liquor store, or the guy, I go in to get the thing and the guy robs the liquor store. And a guy comes running out and he throws the bottle of booze to me as he's on his way out of the thing. Well, I would be standing with my back to the store, I guess, because I was looking at candy. And he would run out and he'd throw the bottle, I'd turn around and I'd catch it. And it worked really well. I caught it really nicely every time. We kept doing it. We kept doing it. I'm thinking, it's working. I don't know why George wants to keep shooting this. One time I turned around, and I turned around late, and the bottle had almost hit the ground, and I just caught it before it hit. And that's the one that he printed. You know, it was like too clean the other way. He wanted it to be, you know, he wanted those mistakes.
There was one scene where Charlie Martin Smith comes from the liquor store and he asked me for some money.
Hey, did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it? You got it. You got it.
I flubbed the line and I said, did you get it? Did you get it? But I kind of flubbed, did you get it?
Hey, did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it?
And I hated the way that scene came out. And so I said, George, can we do it again? He said, nope, that's it. That's the print. And I was like so bummed out that, you know, that was always going to be there, that flubbed line. Every time I see the movie, there it is, you know. So we learned pretty quickly that, you know, you better get it right the first time because he might choose the first take.
When the water balloon hit me in the face, I was supposed to be angry. But I couldn't, you know, I was laughing through the anger, and it just really worked because it's such a bizarre thing to have a water. First of all, the water balloon was supposed to hit here, and the water was supposed to go in my face, but it hit me square in the face. And in rehearsal, you know, we'd been told that the balloon would hit here and the water would go on your face. So that didn't happen. It hit me square in the face, and I was just taken aback. And I remember trying to be really angry, but then I just couldn't help but laugh. And that's what they used. I think we only did it one time. The shaving cream sequence was so much fun. It was also fun, you know, we'd established the shaving cream by me putting some on his nose, and he goes, hey, driving is a serious business. I'm not having any accidents because of you. And it was so much fun doing that shaving cream because I was only supposed to have like 1 can or 2 cans, but we used 17 or 18 cans.
Well, the scene where we put the shaving cream on the car was fun because George just let us do whatever we wanted, and I remember jumping up on the car and jumping off on the other side and jumping up on another part, and the people inside were screaming, and it sort of grew. And after a couple of takes I was doing that, George took me aside and said, you know, Paul, can you try to be a little easy on the car? You know, that's not our car. The girl who owns the car is in there, and she hasn't said anything yet, but, you know, you're marking up the car with your boots. And I said, oh, I didn't realize that. I thought it was a prop or something. I didn't know it was somebody's car.
Well, I was nervous because the guy who owned it was so nervous, and he was never more than a few feet away, and but he didn't realize I was a really good driver because I had a Volkswagen VW that I, you know, with stick shift, so I really understood how to drive, and this was automatic, and it was like no problem for me. But the guy was always polishing and be careful, don't touch this and don't touch that, and don't get too close to the curb, and don't watch out for the white wall, and don't do. All right.
The only research I did for this role was to read the script twice. I had actually lived that in my high school. My boyfriend, who I was deeply in love with, left me for another girl, and it came to me actually and said, I think we should date other people. So it was very, very close to home in that respect. In fact, I remember telling George when he told me that, it was sitting in a car. So I totally understood where this character was coming from and how desperate she was and confused and hurt and would go to any length to win his love and approval back and keep him there, which I thought was a very mean thing to do. But, you know, she was just a girl. She's just 16.
American Graffiti is only my second movie. I was working with some very talented people, but they were also very young. So it was a group of actors, but a group of very young actors who were, you know, teenagers. They're very much like the kids in the movie.
The whole cast was required to be on location for the entire period of the shoot, which left the people who weren't working any particular night hanging around the hotel at night with very little to do, which led to some of the legendary partying.
Cindy and Ronnie and Richard and Charlie and I and Mackenzie kind of gang together, and then there was the other ones, Paul and Harrison, who were like the Hell's Angels of the group, and they were always causing trouble, and we were always gossiping about them.
But Harrison and Paul were, were definitely the rowdy ones.
You didn't joke around with Richard Dreyfuss. He was very serious. But occasionally you could pull a prank on him.
My recollection of it is that they kind of warned him that they were going to throw him in the pool. And so there was a kind of a little kind of cat and mouse interplay there going on for a while.
If I remember correctly, I was walking from one place to another.
I grabbed him and said, "Do you want to try it?" And he said, "No, no," and I threw him in the pool.
Head first into the shallow end, so that I got a big, thing on my forehead.
Which suddenly made this joke a non-joke, and he came up holding his head, and I jumped in and grabbed him, and he was saying, I'm all right, but he'd actually hit his head on the pool. So, boy, did I feel bad.
And then that night he had to shoot the scene where he's inducted into the Pharaohs, and he had a black eye. And I was the only one who'd brought any makeup because I was the eldest. And I had some pancake makeup. And so we kind of put it under Richard's eye. And I looked for it when I saw the movie, and you can if you know it's there, you can kind of see his black eye from that.
But it's been almost 30 years, and I've almost gotten over it.
George Lucas, knowing me, feeling comfortable with me, he allowed me to intrude my opinions on scenes relating to the actors, because a lot of the shooting, I'd be sitting in a car with an actor, with Richard Dreyfuss, for example.
Rick Dreyfuss had a mannerism, which I think he still has. He rocks up and down on his toes. And he would do this without in any shot. I remember Haskell Wexler mentioning this.
Towards the beginning of the film, Haskell, as we were getting together, Haskell says, Richard, come over here. Come here. And he then called everyone, come over here. Come on, and he called the whole crew and cast together. And then he said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do an imitation of Richard Dreyfuss's acting. And then he went, then he turned to me and he said, be still. And then he walked away. I was jumping around too much.
At that time, I didn't understand when they would shoot out of sequence, not in order. So they were doing the sock hop, which I thought was so exciting. And all my little team members, my gymnast team members, were working as atmosphere. So I jumped into the sock hop and learned the sock hop, and I was running around, and all of a sudden they yelled, cut. And an AD ran in there and says, you can't be in this scene, you're supposed to be in the bathroom. And I said, but you're not shooting in the bathroom right now. He says, no, you don't understand. In the film, you're in the bathroom. So then they pulled me out of the scene.
George Lucas shot all of the dance scenes, all of the scenes up on the stage, all of our stuff, and the bathroom stuff before it. Ron Howard's and mine in one day.
But a really interesting day. Also, in the small world category, I acted in that scene with Kathleen Quinlan, who I directed years later in Apollo 13, where she actually got an Oscar nomination for Apollo 13. American Graffiti was shot more or less in sequence. And what was great about it was that as the production wore on, we became more and more exhausted. By the end, we all had circles under our eyes, and we looked like we'd been up all night. Well, we had been up all night for weeks, and it showed. But everybody became kind of, a little punchy.
We were all staying at this hotel, and working from basically 9 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning. And then we go back to the hotel, where there was a convention of dentists who were not on the night shift. They were on the day shift. So they were in the pool, and they were raucous. So I never slept. I think I didn't sleep for a month. That's what it felt like. But it was also thrilling, I mean, it was my first, what I thought of as my first film, really. And and we were out together on this adventure.
We didn't have any sort of creature comforts. I mean, there were no dressing rooms or anything.
On American Graffiti, we all had to share the same trailer.
One Winnebago, all the wardrobe was in it, the makeup was in it. We didn't wear makeup, but the girls had their makeup and their hair. Everything happened in this one thing.
So that you literally were you were standing next to the costumes like this, and someone was putting makeup on like that, like.
We all got pretty cozy that way, seeing everyone in their underwear half the time. And so we were always on top of each other, you know, when we weren't in our, you know, rooms at the hotel.
There were no even chairs, you know, on the set, nothing. You had to sit on a curb or in a car.
Sometimes in the cars, and it'll be Ron Howard and myself sitting in the front seat, Richard Dreyfuss will be asleep in the back seat because we had nowhere to go.
But I finally went to Francis and I said, you know, Francis, I know it's a low-budget movie. It's great. The spirit of the movie is wonderful. Do you think we could have a chair? Could we just have chairs? He said, well, no, there's nothing in the budget for chairs.
You know, we believed very much that films should be lean and mean, and there should be no amenities, and you should get in and do it and get out, and that's where we made movies in those days.
It doesn't look like it in the movie. It was supposed to be the summer, a hot summer, but it was cold. We were like wearing sweatshirts and things between takes. And then it was an acting task to pretend it was hot. To sit there, oh yeah, it's hot, okay, action. And then, give me my jacket when you say cut.
We called it guerrilla movie making. I said to George one night that it reminded me of the first movies that were ever shot in Hollywood, where film companies would pull up at a porch, get up on that porch, and they would make a scene, and they would shoot the thing, and the owner would come out, get out, you movies! Get away from here, you movies! And they would run away. And that's what shooting graffiti was like.
George is not overly fond of the actual shooting part of filmmaking.
He would leave in the morning and go to the editing bay and edit all day and then come back and direct all night.
He was frequently very tired. It was a long slog for him, and although it was only 28 days of shooting, I'm quite sure that George was working both day and night on the film.
The difficulty with American Graffiti was mostly just the fact that it was a very short schedule. 28 days is a very short time, or 28 nights is even worse. It's a very short amount of time to shoot a picture in. So mostly I was tired and harassed and, you know, just exhausted the entire experience.
Wolfman Jack was famous all over the United States. We used some tapes that he had recorded, some bits of business with call-in. He had a call-in show, somebody who would want to dedicate music. Wolfman came in and he did probably 5 or 10% of what you hear him doing is newly recorded, but most of it's from real sessions that Wolfman had already done. When you finally meet him, it's a little like the moment at the end of The Wizard of Oz when Toto pulls the curtain aside and you see that a voice that came from everywhere and seemed to know everything and control everything. After all, it's just a little man twirling some dials in a secret control booth.
We had written the scene for Wolfman where Rick visits him. George called and he said, I think we can talk Wolfman into doing it, but if you would visit him at the station. The station happened to be about 3 blocks from where we were living. So we drove to visit Wolfman. It was exactly like in the movie where Rick visits Wolfman. He was on the air and we came in and we gave him the scene. When he read it, he was so moved. He said, this is absolutely wonderful. You know, I'm dying to do this. So for me, it was like me meeting an icon. I mean, you know, we had grown up with Wolfman Jack and then we drove 3 blocks back home.
That's empowering for Kurt, and it's one of the things that allows him, kind of like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, to leave this place and go on to his greater destiny in the world outside. And interestingly, he's the only person to see Wolfman. You know, of the 4 guys, he's the only one to actually meet the Wolfman, and he's the only one to leave.
Rock and roll will stand, man!
In those days, which is 1962, when the film was supposed to be happening, you weren't allowed to have personalized license plates. You got whatever they gave you, and at that time there were 3 letters and 3 digits on a California license plate. Nonetheless, George wanted to have something that indicated the existence of his previous film, and so if you look, you'll see John's car. The license plate of John's car is THX 138.
I remember in a night scene we were shooting on the street in Graffiti that there was a theater in the background with the marquee saying Dementia 13.
Which is Francis Coppola's first film.
You know, it's an issue of period, you know, what would have been playing, and George gave me the honor of putting my movie up on the marquee.
I was told that it's very important to get it in a frame, and I remember also that it didn't fit the frame exactly, so I had to get some crazy lower angle with the car in the foreground so we could see it.
So there are these little inside references to these two previous films.
The crash at the end of the movie, we'd used a car that had been in two-lane blacktop, and it had been all sort of fixed up, and it had all kinds of anti-roll bars and been lowered and everything, and it was really hard to roll it.
And we always had to shoot it at dawn, so it was a magic hour shot, and we had only one chance, one take, each time we tried. I think the first time the car went off the road and didn't roll.
So I just took the car out and we tipped it over, and I shot the scenes, and we tipped over we had a second car that was all gutted, and we blew it up, and I shot the whole ending without the piece where the car actually spins and rolls. So I came back with a second stuntman about 2 weeks later, and we tried to shoot it again. He couldn't roll it. And then we came back again. I think we came back almost 4 or 5 times before we finally were able to roll that car. Actually just get the shot of it tumbling over.
The final scene of the movie was supposed to be shot on another night. And Ron Howard and myself had worked all night, and they had released us, and we were getting dressed, and we were in our street clothes.
And then all of a sudden, they said, okay, you just gotta get out there.
Get back into your costumes. We're gonna shoot the last scene now because we're having trouble with the stunt, and we have to do it this way.
I'd never been involved in anything shot in that sort of docu-style. It was exhilarating.
And Harrison and I just said, we'll begin the scene by, I'll be hysterical. I think George said, be hysterical, Cindy, which was not difficult to do at this point. And I was hitting him, and we did the whole scene in one with 2 cameras rolling.
Cindy Williams and I just sort of improvised the scene of getting back together and making sure she was all right, and me telling her that I wasn't going to go, and Haskell shot that all handheld out in the field, and we had just a 5-minute window to do it because he needed to catch the light at just the right moment during the dawn, and it was very exciting.
And that was it. It was one take.
I had kind of mixed emotions because here it was this sort of climactic moment for my character in the movie, and it was all started, shot, and finished within about 5 or 6 minutes. And I thought, wow, how could that be? How could that be any good? Vincent Minnelli would have taken all day on this.
We didn't know the scene. We hadn't learned it. We weren't supposed to be doing it that night. And they're saying, light, the sun is just coming up. We got to get out there. We got to do it now. They set up this dolly shot, and Paul and I tried to run the lines, but we didn't remember them. So we just did an improv. And it is a classic kind of acting school improv, that last scene.
They didn't want me to put anybody at the end of the movie. That was their basic idea, which is it wrecks the movie. And I said, no, it doesn't. It puts the whole thing in perspective.
We thought it was too explicit, but people were absolutely blown away by it.
But every time you take this really strong position about this is really terrible and why do you need something so obvious? And then when the picture became a hit, of course we got all these phone calls. What really made it in the move for me in the movie was the epilogue, and George had been really insistent on the epilogue of wrapping up the people's lives.
Then she said, well, if you're going to put the guys there, why don't you put the girls there? I said, well, if you have 8 people at the end of the movie instead of 4 people, it's 2 cards. It's 2 cards, it's twice as long, and it kind of disrupts, you don't, it's like a little explanation point that's at the end of the movie. It isn't a big thing. So for creative reasons, I said, no, this is about these 4 guys.
Well, I thought it would have been interesting to see what happened to the girls too, but it was a choice that was, that George obviously made for a reason, and I think that reason was that it smacked of the times.
Ultimately, it's really a movie about 2 guys, Kurt and Steve. One goes, the other stays.
The fact that I knew that Steve was going to wind up being an insurance salesman and stay there definitely informed my performance. This was not an entirely adventuresome person.
It was always part of the idea. So when we were shooting it, I certainly knew that that's where this guy would end up. And that, to me, was an important part of that character. George showed a bunch of stuff at the wrap party. He showed a kind of a montage, which was really a nice thing for him to do for all of us, because we were dying. We kept saying, when can we see something? We were just so anxious to see something. And he showed us a bunch of stuff at the wrap party, and it looked so good. We were just so jazzed. We thought, wow, this could really be a good movie.
The first cut of the picture was done, and it, you know, I'd put all these songs down, and I'd written the scenes of the songs and everything. When we cut the whole thing together, it was a 3-hour movie. So it was, you know, obviously I couldn't release a 3-hour movie. So it took another 6 months for me to get the film cut down to be the 100 minutes that it finally ended up being, or get it to be as good as it was in the original 3-hour version.
The challenge of doing the film was to both achieve what George wanted, which was wall-to-wall music, and yet do it in an interesting way that not only allowed you to enjoy the story, but somehow made you feel even more that you were swimming in the world in which these kids swam all the time.
I wanted the sound to have that kind of very documentary, realistic feel to it. So we took the records and we re-recorded them in situations where streets, gyms, between buildings, and moved the speakers around when we were re-recording it. So it sounded a lot like what it would sound like if the music was coming from a passing car, to create that reality.
So that was how we eventually came up with the technique of worldizing the music, of plunging it into the world acoustically, into which it apparently was when you looked at the image. I think one of the more extreme examples of what we did with the soundtrack in terms of mixing those various components was the period when Kurt is kicked out of the car. When you're in the car, you're hearing the sort of close-in, muffled, slightly muffled sound of car radio speakers of the time. And then when he gets kicked out and he's at those crossroads kind of wondering, you know, what's going to happen next, the music becomes probably the most ethereal that it ever is in the film. The music in the film, not only is it true to the story and the time in which the story takes place, but the music acts like, sometimes like a Greek chorus to sort of comment on the events that are taking place. Steve and Laurie are asked to dance this, and they come out, and the song is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. The subject matter of the song is in some way talking about what's going on between the two of them, and also what we did acoustically with it was to start out with the sound being this very big gymnasium sound, and as they danced, to compress it and to make it more and more like the song that people hear in their head. If we had kept the music in the gymnasium world completely, it would have not contributed to the meaning of the scene, because the sound would have constantly have reminded you that you are in a gymnasium, a big empty gymnasium. But at a certain point, emotionally, the scene doesn't want that. The budget for the sound, for the music track in American Graffiti, I think was in the neighborhood of $80,000, which worked out to something like $2,000 per song. Very low by today's standards, impossible by today's standards. As a result, there was no money left over for conventional music. Where we would have put some tension music, we just simply didn't have any money to pay for that. It was all going to these songs.
And then on top of it, because I had music completely through the movie, and the music was treated more like a sound effect than it was like traditional score, I used the absence of music and sound effects to create the drama, which normally what you do is you'd use the music to create the drama and the sound effects to create the realism. I used the music to create the realism and the sound effects to create the drama.
So George asked me to come up with something in sound, some sort of sound montage that would approximate what we might have gotten with music. And those are the scenes where Kurt hooks the chain underneath the police car, And in the background, there's a little symphony for diesel train. If you listen carefully, you can hear that. As he's doing this, there's a train going by. The scene where Toad and Debbie are walking along the canal, what you hear on the soundtrack is a concoction of creaky sounds from a eucalyptus grove in the wind, perhaps the howling of a wolf, and is that the bleating of a goat? And coming up underneath that is a heartbeat sound. Right at the climactic moment when Toad suddenly thinks that he's lost Debbie to the goat killer.
Debbie?
At that point, all of these scary sounds go away.
Don't do that. Come on, let's get out of here.
He showed it to an audience, invited the studio to come and see it, and they hadn't seen it. This was the first time they'd ever seen it. And the audience loved it, went crazy, and the studio didn't like it very much.
Yeah, the executive from Universal was there, and he came up to me with a grave face, and he said, well, he said, we have a lot of work, and I just couldn't believe that he didn't see what he had, and George was cowering in the background, because he didn't want to get in the middle of this, and I remember telling the guy, I said, listen, if Universal doesn't want the picture, I'll buy the picture today for what you have in it. And I remember telling him, I said, you should get on your knees and thank this young man for what he's done for your career.
When the movie was finished, and Universal was very worried about it in every regard, what they were going to do with it, there was talk of putting it on television, and they just didn't know what to do.
We would have screenings whenever somebody like from the marketing department or somebody at Universal wanted to see the movie. We'd always get all the production assistants and the secretaries, and we'd fill the theater. So every time we do it, we'd do it in the big theater with 100 seats, and we'd fill the 100 seats. So if 2 or 3 people wanted to see the movie, there'd always be 100 there. And eventually word got around town that this was a great movie, and everybody wanted to see it. And it was really out of that enthusiasm of really the low-level people at Universal that the movie ended up getting released in a theater. So I didn't really have high hopes for the movie. I liked it. I knew the audience liked it, but, it's one of those things that you don't really expect it to take off and be a hit.
The title, American Graffiti, was George's inspiration, and he never doubted it, and he was absolutely convinced that that was the right title, and we were getting lots of pressure from Universal or whoever the other people were that were involved in marketing that, basically people didn't know what graffiti really meant necessarily, that they would think it's a movie about feet. I remember someone telling me, and I must confess that I didn't agree with it, but I was saying to George, well, let's just come up with another name, any kind of dumb name that will kind of be more clear that this is a film about an era of rock and roll and what have you, and we all suggested stupid names, and it was George. I have to hand it to George. I says, look, at the name is American Graffiti, and that's it.
There was a lot of wrangling that went on, and then the studio decided they needed to cut 5 minutes out of it to make it shorter.
And as a result of that, 3 scenes got pulled from the film. It was the scene where Steve tells off the teacher at the gymnasium. And then there was a scene after a little incident at a stoplight where Toad pulls Steve's car over to the side and looks at the damage, and there's a car salesman sitting on a gigantic seat that George discovered. It was a real thing that George discovered. And then there's a scene with Harrison Ford singing Some Enchanted Evening to Laurie.
And then when Star Wars came out and was a big hit, I forced them to put the 5 minutes back in for the video. So now on the video and all the releases that are out there, it's always, my version, not their version. Their version has disappeared.
In our minds, we couldn't imagine this picture would be a success because it was such a small picture and it had no movie stars or anything you associate with a Hollywood success. So we're standing in the unemployment line collecting our unemployment, and behind us is Rick Dreyfuss, also in the employment line, and he said, well, you know, have you heard about the screenings? And he said, oh God, I ruined the picture. I just feel so bad. I just destroyed the movie. And you know, we were very nervous. We didn't know what to say, and we kept saying, no, we think you're really good. But you know, we can't imagine the movie will do anything. And then a person in front of us in the line said, hey, I was at a sneak of that preview last night. That movie's really great.
Well, I got terrible reviews in San Francisco. San Francisco Chronicle said it was the worst film ever made. You know, they have these little men that sit in boxes, and you know, he's either standing up cheering, or he's clapping, or he's just sitting there, or he's asleep, or he's not in the chair. Well, American Graffiti is not even in the chair. So that was the San Francisco opinion of it, which was extremely low. But fortunately, a lot of the rest of the country liked the movie. Whenever you do a movie like that, you know, you get bad reviews, you get good reviews. I would say that probably on that one, 70% of the reviews are very good, and you know, 30% were pretty awful. You know, there are themes that I've been fascinated with, and they start at THX and they continue through American Graffiti and they go into Star Wars, and they evolve and mature. But I like to take themes that I feel strongly about and then put them in different kinds of situations and explore them in different contexts. And that's a lot of what was going on in all three of those movies. You'll see a lot of issues reemerge in different ways. In all three of those movies, it's about a lead character who is put into a situation where they have to make a decision to leave. They're all about that transitional time in a person's life when you have to make a very major change. How do you become brave enough to take one step beyond and go into something that you're not really that experienced at? It was one of the first films to use music from records. It was one of the first movies to ever tell 4 stories simultaneously and have the 4 stories not really be connected with each other. The studio said that was impossible. You can't do that. You have to tell one story and then the next story and the next story and the next story. Well, now all of television is done that way. I mean, almost every television show has got that style. But at the time, it was extremely controversial. And one of the reasons that a lot of the studios would not touch it was because I was trying to intercut these 4 stories. It seems like now it's like ridiculous, but at the time it was a big issue. They wouldn't make the movie. They didn't feel the story had enough, you know, Hollywood pizzazz. I mean, they wanted a murder. They wanted kids getting killed. They wanted to have it be, you know, really hyper. And I didn't want to do that. You know, I was fortunately able to make it because I made it for so little money. I think one of the reasons it was as successful as it was because it was very different from the standard fare of the time. It's interesting because Star Wars sort of suffered from the same fate. People don't realize with these kind of movies that have become very successful. I mean, American Graffiti is one of the most successful investments of all time. The return on the dollar spent is, I think, greater than almost any other movie made. But it's because of the fact that they're fresh and they're different and they're experimental that I think people like to watch them. Now the whole industry sort of moves in that direction and they become the standard, but people forget that at the time those movies were made, especially American Graffiti, it was a very avant-garde movie.